Hello, I'm Jacqueline King. Welcome to my sewing space. I'm here to inspire and encourage the new or frustrated sewer. Today we will be finalizing our series on basic sewing skills. If you've been following along in this series, you've seen us hem jeans, dress slacks, and now we're going to get on our buttons. Simple sewing skills that will save you money and frustration in doing it at home. To begin, we're going to be doing several different button types. Now, when you see what I'm doing here today, it's going to look a little weird because I'm using white threads with different colored buttons on a sample button placket I have made. All of this is to make it easier for you to see. Obviously at home, you're going to use a thread that is the same color as your button, and your button will be appropriate to your project, either a garment or a coat. So, for our regular garment sewing, we will be looking at a 2-hole, a 4-hole, and a shank button. When we finish that, we're going to sew a button on a jacket. And each of these has little variations in technique, and that's why I'm taking the time to be so specific. You might think that sewing a button on is a no-brainer. Maybe for some it is, but to do it neatly so that it stays on, there are a few things to consider. And to make it look nice. We always want to be sewing excellent, even when it comes to something as simple as a button. So let's get ready to sew. What will you need? Well, thread, needle, button, and your garment. If you're using a regular sewing thread, such as goes on your sewing machine, you will want to have a product such as Thread Magic or beeswax to run your thread through. I've explained this in previous videos that this will keep your thread from tangling as you sew. For your coat, you will be using a heavier thread called button twist. And that is because your coats, heavier garments, are going to get more wear and tear, and you need something sturdier for that. You will need a toothpick, and you'll see that soon. You will need straight pins and of course your buttons. So let's get ready to sew. We're going to begin with our 2-hole button. For this project, and a medium weight garment, I've chosen a moderate shank. You could also use something a little smaller. But notice our eye is narrow. You do not want a big fat eye at the head of your needle, because as this needle is pulled through, this head is going to be separating your threads. So lighter weight fabrics, narrower eyes. All right. Let's begin with our 2-hole button. You see that I have placed a straight pin here, marking my point. That will be handy for you to do, but it not only shows you where to sew, it's going to provide another mechanism for us, which is giving your button lift. Now, what do I mean by lift? Lift will raise the button off the surface of the garment and make it easier when you're finished to go through the buttonhole. You'll see what I mean in a moment. To start, for a 2-hole with a vertical buttonhole, your holes will go parallel. I put my needle in the center of my mark and come up And this is kind of an eyeball thing. I'm guesstimating where that first hole will lie. Pull it through. And now your knot will be hidden under your button when you sew. Put your needle through that top hole, leaving this pin in the garment. Lay your button over your mark. In the bottom hole and up through your original. Pull. You see how I'm holding the button up? This makes it easy to find. In the bottom hole, tip. Try to keep your threads in the same place. Now, if you have a little bit thicker garment, you don't have to go all the way through. Just catch the surface of it, which actually makes it much neater on the back side. But if you come through, it's fine. Just try to come through in the same place each time so that it's not messy. Now, how many times? 3 or 4. If it's a pair of pajamas or a blouse, you don't need to go over and over and over. And I should have probably said first that I am sewing with 2 strands here. I think you can see that. So I've now gone through 4 times. At this point, I go in through the bottom, back up, and now I will give a 1, 2 wrap. And that's going to pull all of those threads together. Needle in just a tiny bit of fiber of the fabric, just enough to make a knot. Pull, secure, and one more time. Now don't make your knot in your threads. It will not stay in. It'll come apart. My needle goes into the fibers of the garment to make my knot. I can pull out my pin. And one more thing we always want to do is hide the tail of our thread. So I'm trying to go in the top layer of the placket only, pull it through, and snip. Now, why do we do our buttonholes vertical? Because when we go over here to close it, that buttonhole should come right together. If you turn this and sew your buttonholes so that they are horizontal to the garment buttonhole, they will push this apart. Let me see if I can, like so. It'll always want to push that buttonhole. This is nice and secure. So that is our 2-hole button. The lift gives you a bit of separation between the garment and the button because there's thickness here. All these threads, I know you can't feel it, but what I'm feeling right now is thick. There's interfacing in there and lots of tiny threads. One thing you do not want to do on any button ever is sew it tight to the garment. The minute you sew it tight down and that is laying absolutely secured on top of that fabric, you're going to struggle buttoning. So keep that straight pin in, give a couple of wraps of your thread, and you will have just enough lift. And that is good and secure. Let's move on to the 4-hole button. If you are replacing a button on a garment you already have, look closely and pay attention to the way they have stitched your button. There are 2 ways you can sew this on. You can go vertical twice or an X. If I'm making a garment, I always want to sew in an X because it gives a better finish, and again, like the 2-hole button, it won't push that buttonhole out. When you sew an X, it not only gives a neater finish, but it is stronger. But if you're replacing a button on a garment you already have and they have sewn bottom to top, bottom to top, bottom to top, bottom to top, do it. Just sew vertically because you don't want to have an X when your other buttons aren't sewn that way. I say an X is preferred for 4-hole buttons, but you do you. All right, let's get a close-up. Needle in at the center point and now pivot on a diagonal. Pull your thread all the way through. Pick any hole and drop your button onto your garment. Placing your needle in the opposite or diagonal hole. This gets easier the more you do it. Now I'm going diagonally this way. Back up to that original entry point. When you're doing this at home, it is not as complicated as it looks. It's a little bit more difficult because I'm doing this for the camera. Needle in that top hole. Keep your straight pin in, remember. And now, once we have it anchored, you can lift and tip, just like we did before. I'm going to go 3 or 4, just like in the 2-button hole. But on this, my last pass through the bottom, I will now tip and come on the bottom side of my original entry point. Looks a little confusing, but you'll get it when you do it at home. So having moved over here, I can now come in the bottom. You know, I've failed to say also, once again, that I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, you're just going to have to work these steps out the opposite. What works for you. Okay, now we really got the button anchored, which makes it much easier. So I go in that top hole, out at the bottom, and we're going to call that good. You know, if you're sewing buttons for children, take a few extra stitches. They are amazingly able to pull anything apart. Take your thread, wrap, remove your pin, and just like before, find a couple of fibers, not many. You don't want a big fat lump under there. Pull, and one more time right next to the original knot. Neatness counts, makes for a much better presentation. separately to make sure. There we go. Snuggled in. Slide the needle in between the layers of the placket. You're not going through the bottom. And pull to hide the tail. This is how we eliminate any problems with hairs. Those little thread hairs showing. So what is a shank button, you might be asking? A shank is a button that does not have holes on top, but there is a metal or plastic piece in the bottom where your thread comes through. Because of this, you do not need a straight pin for lift. Your shank is the lift, and shanks usually go in garments that are a little bit thicker in the placket. They will rock a little bit, so you do want to sew them tight. Once again, we put our needle in at the very center, but this time we're only taking a very tiny bit of fiber. We can remove our straight pin. That was only for the mark. Now, put your finger behind. Put that needle in right to, I am putting the needle into the right, my right of this knot, bringing it over just next to the left. And you'll see why that sounds, gosh, why does she say it like that? Well, there's a reason. You want to begin your stitching to the left of the knot. Now we go in from the bottom, out the top. Needle goes to the right of the knot and out the left. Now, again, this is awkward for me because I'm trying to let you see everything. I'm going to pull it down, making sure that this does not get twisted like so. You don't want that. Keep your eyeballs on that shank and make sure that it stays like so. Now that we have it anchored, put it in on my left and out to my right. Back in the fabric from my right to left, left to right, right to left, left to right. There we go. Now, metal buttons have a tendency to slice through the thread with wear much faster than plastic buttons. So I would go 5 or 6 times. Well, sir, there we go. All right, I'm going to go into the garment one more time and out the left, tugging it tight. Oh yes, we tug the shank tight. And at the left side now we find a fiber or 2 to make our knot. Once again, do not make your knot in your thread. It will come out. Your button will fall off. And once you have that secured with 2 knots, slide your needle in carefully to just catch the top side of the fabric placket and hide your thread. And now you know how to nicely, effectively sew on a 2-hole 4-hole and shank button. Voila! I'm going to make a little room and we're going to bring up our jacket. Set these out of the way. Okay, I've got my jacket up here ready to go, but first, a couple of mentions. On a jacket or a coat, you're likely to notice that your buttonhole is different. One end is wider. That is because your fabric is much thicker. The button you will use is much thicker, and it needs that extra room to move through easily. Because our fabric is thicker and our button is thicker, it makes sense that our thread will be thicker too. As I mentioned in the opening of the video, we will be using a buttonhole twist. Upholstery weight thread is also good for this, but you do want to use heavier duty than regular sewing machine. Now, looking at your needle, it makes sense that it will be larger too. The eye has to accommodate the heavier thread. And you may think that that sounds silly that I'm mentioning that, but I promise you, in the past, many times I made the mistake of grabbing a little needle and trying to force the big thread through it. It doesn't work. So what are we about here? Ending frustration, right? When you're sewing a button on a coat or jacket, you're going to use a bigger needle. Let's get sewing. All right. As before, I have a pin which is marking my placement for my button. On a coat, you need a higher rise than this straight pin will allow. So once I go in, the same way, move to the left because we're sewing a 4-hole. I'm going to pull that through and remove that pin and replace it with a toothpick. Now, some people will sew with the toothpick on top, others underneath. I think it's easier with it underneath because right now I'm going to take a stitch diagonally and we're going to anchor that toothpick in there. So why a toothpick? Because I need more room to accommodate this thick thread, a higher rise, if you will. So now that I have my toothpick in place, we're going to do what we did before. We're going to sew an X, and yes, same thing goes if you have a jacket or a coat and you have vertical stitching, go ahead and do that to replace it. But when you can, use that cross stitch. All right. Boom. There we go. I've got it started. See how high that button is off the jacket? That's necessary. And you're going to see at the end there's another little thing we do slightly different. So I should be pretty anchored. Go in, pivot up. Now, how many times? Probably 4 to 5. You can go 6, but remember you're adding thickness all the time. I'm going to go up one more time. And again, you see how my thread is wanting to slightly twist on me? You can work that out all the time. Be aware of that, because that's when it will knot up on you. Okay, now when I go in, we are going to pivot underneath that original point. And I'm ready to go in the other direction. Sorry. I know it's not convenient for you, but I'm trying to see. There we go. Okay. And likewise before. You are going to have a much easier time than I am right now, I guarantee it. Whenever you demonstrate something, you're not sewing in your usual form. Now I'm going to pivot up. And now it's time to remove our toothpick. Look at the height we have. That's a beautiful thing. And now we're going to really wrap. 1, and you're pulling, you're putting tension. 2, 3, I'm going to go 4 times. You see the height we have there? It's lovely. And I will go into the velvet fiber. Okay, just a little bit. I want to mention, I have heard other people suggest that you sew with more than 2 strands, whether you're doing a regular garment or a coat, and I don't do that. I only use 2 strands, whatever I'm sewing. The reason is when you go to make a knot and you have 3 or 4 strands of thread, you're going to have a big lump. We don't want ugly lumps. We just want a nice secure knot. And I will go in the top layer of my fabric. You see? That's slightly through, but that's okay. And I'm going to show you something else in just a minute. But we're hiding our tail. One more mention. These are back buttons. They're either colored or clear, and you will sometimes find them on the back side of a coat or jacket. I don't use them unless I'm repairing a jacket that has had them. The purpose is, it's to keep the thread from cutting the fabric. So when do you really need them? Mostly with leather and especially with vinyl. If you have a vinyl jacket or coat, you want to have a back button because that thread in short time will saw right through that vinyl. So instead of sewing into the fibers, you are sewing through to another button and you will cross stitch it. It's a little bit tricky and it takes patience, but it's very doable and it will give you a longer lasting garment. Well, that is it. Not too stressful, is it? Actually, it's not stressful at all, and it's one of those little hand sewing things that can be a stress reducer when you've practiced and done it a few times. Oh, let me finish by closing our jacket. And you see how easily those buttons move through. It makes a difference. A simple task done beautifully. You can do it. And I hope that in my shop, I never have to sew another button on. I shouldn't have to. You can do it at home. Save yourself money and save yourself time. And in emergencies, save yourself a lot of pain. I hope you learned something good today that you'll be able to use yourself And thank you so much for tuning in. Please remember to leave comments, ask questions, tell me what you'd like to see next, give us a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and do share. You must know someone that needs this information. Thank you, and God bless.